Are you migrating from consumption logic apps to standard logic apps and wondering how your connections will work? I'll be honest, when I first started working with standard logic apps, I was confused by the new connection setup. Coming from consumption, where everything was just handled for you, suddenly I'm dealing with application settings, built-in versus managed connectors, and trying to figure out Visual Studio Code development workflows. If you've been scratching your head about the same things, this video is for you. I'm going to walk you through exactly how connection setup changes between these two models, sharing the insights I wish I had when I started, and more importantly, show you step by step how to set up connections in a standard logic app using Visual Studio Code. In this video, we'll cover why connections work differently in standard logic apps, the key differences between built-in and managed connections, a walkthrough of setting up Service Bus and Dataverse connections in Visual Studio Code, migration strategies and common pitfalls to avoid, best practices for managing connection configuration. Whether you're just starting your migration or you're already knee-deep in standard logic apps, you'll walk away with practical knowledge you can use immediately. So let's get started. Before we dive in, let me quickly show you what we are working with. Here's a consumption logic app with a Service Bus connection. The connection is created as an Azure resource automatically as a result of setting up the connection in the logic app workflow manually. So the workflow will get the reference to the connection Azure resource in the connections parameter named $connections in the logic app workflow code. And here is the same scenario in a standard logic app. Quite a different approach, much more control, but also more setup required. Let's break this down. The biggest thing to understand here is that we are moving from a multi-tenant to a single-tenant architecture. In consumption logic apps, your connections run on Microsoft shared infrastructure, what we call managed connections or API connections. But in standard logic apps, you get two options. You can still use those managed connections, or you can use built-in connections that run directly inside your logic app's runtime. This is huge because it means low latency, better security, and more control over your connections. Let me show you the practical difference. With a managed connection, when your logic app needs to send a message to Service Bus, for example, it makes a call out to Azure's connector service, which then calls Service Bus. That's two network hubs. With a built-in connection, your logic app talks directly to Service Bus, one network hub, low latency, and it all happens within your secured environment. There are trade-offs, however. Built-in connectors are only available for certain services: Service Bus, HTTP, Azure Storage, SQL Server, and a few others. For software as a service services like Office 365 or Salesforce or Dataverse, you'll still need managed connections. Alright, let's get hands-on. First, make sure you have Visual Studio Code with the Azure Logic Apps standard extension installed. If you don't have the extension installed, go to the list of extensions and select Azure Logic Apps standard extension. Click on Install button and make sure it installs also this Azure extension. I will explain why you need it a bit later. Once you have the extension, create a new Logic App project. First of all, create a root folder which will contain your project. And let's go to this Azure extension. Sign into Azure first. Signed in. Then on the workspace, find this tiny Logic App icon, click it, and select Create New Logic App Workspace menu item. In this dialog, you have to select the folder which will contain your workspace and I will just select the one I have already created, then the workspace name, and select the template for the Logic App workspace. I choose Logic App, then the Logic App name, it will be the name to your project. You have to select the workflow template. I choose the stateful, then the workflow name. I usually use the data type which the workflow handles, for instance, account data. At this step, we've got all the files of the project created. Let's switch back to the files. And you see that we have under the root folder, we have the workspace folder, then the Logic App project folder, and the workspace file. I will tell you what we'll do with this file a bit later. Under Logic App project folder, you'll find the workflow folder with a workflow file, the one which is open here. It is empty now. And then we have the host.json file. The standard Logic App is built on Azure Function Runtime, so you'll find host.json file here, the same which is used in Azure Functions. Local settings file, which will be used for all your settings, connection strings used locally under debugging. When you select the workspace file, you'll find the project location and use this button to open the workspace. You're switched to the context of the workspace now. And if you open the workflow file, let's use the connectors from Azure. It asks me to select the resource group. With the right click on the workflow file, you should open the designer to be able to build your workflow. So here you see the standard Logic App Designer, which works in the Azure portal, but now it works locally in your Visual Studio Code. You have to start with adding the trigger. I will add the simplest one, HTTP trigger. Okay. And then I want to add the service bus action. I'll choose the send message, and you see that this is the built-in action which uses built-in connection. I have to give the connection name here. For simplicity, I will use the connection string. You should use managed identity for authorization of access to service bus. This gives you a higher level of security and management of security. It has created the send message action. Here I need to choose the queue or topic. And here we've got the connections.json file. This file is used to store the properties of the connection to the, in this case, to the service bus. Under service provider connections, it will contain properties of all the built-in connections of your workflow. Pay attention to the property connection string, which contains the reference to the application setting with the name service bus connection string. So the connection string which I have pasted in the dialog of creation of a service bus action in the workflow was actually defined as the application settings parameter and not stored openly in the configuration file. If we switch to the local settings file, we'll find the service bus connection string variable here with a value containing the connection string to the service bus. But this is only for local development and debugging. In production, after deployment of the Logic App to Azure, this value will be written to the environment variable with the same name. So as you see, connections file is a storage of definitions of your connections. And moreover, you can manually create more connections here. So, for instance, I add a new connection, service bus 2. The display name will be service bus 2 connection with the same connection string. I've got a typo here, sorry. This one, okay. I have to close this workflow in the designer and open it again to be refreshed. Update it from the config file. And then I select the send message action again and click on change connection. Here you can see now 2 connections. Both are taken from the connections file. Okay. Right. And next, app settings. App settings will contain a connection stream value, but to store the connection stream more securely, you should use key vault instead of writing the connection string in the environment variable in the app settings. So for this, you can use the following syntax. This is the referencing of the key vault where you specify this by key vault name, and you take the value from secrets with a secret name, and this will be stored in the environment variable of your logic app, while the value of the connection string will physically be located in the key vault. So this gives you an extra level of security, and you should use it in the production deployments of your solutions, of your logic app. I already mentioned that built-in connections exist not for all services, and for some of them we still have to continue using managed connectors, and Dataverse one of them. So I'm going to show you how the managed connection is defined in the setup of the standard logic app. So let's go to the same workflow and open it in the designer. And I'm going to add the Dataverse action. Let's choose, for example, the list rows. And here I'm going to create a connection. I have already one connection created earlier. I will show you how to create a new one. Let's call it the Dataverse connection. And for simplicity, I will use OAuth authentication. It will be using my personal credentials. I'm authorized by the Dataverse system, and we can find it with the name Dataverse connection. Okay, so here I have to choose the environment, and then accounts, for example. So the action is set up. Click Save. And now in the connections file, we can find a new element, managed API connections, in addition to the element service provider connections. So service provider connections is for built-in connectors. Managed API is for managed API connections. And here we can find the one I have just created. And let's see to the details of the definition of this connection. We have a few application settings, like workflow subscription ID, workflow's location name, which is geographic location, workflow resource group name, and a couple of parameters. So app settings are data which will be stored in the application settings of the logic app. Parameters reside in the parameters file, so we can find them here. Common Data Service is the old name for Dataverse. So we have here the connection runtime URL and authentication key. So here we've got the parameters used by connections. And local settings contain these definition of additional properties like the resource group name, location name, subscription ID, tenant ID. All these values build up the setup infrastructure, setup of connections to external data. The connections and parameters files will be deployed to the Logic App in Azure as is, as files, and values from the local settings files. We have to take care to create them with the deployment process, create them in the Logic App environment variables. And how you do it depends on your development process. It may be done manually. It may be done by the CI/CD process, where you use the ARM template or bicep file to automate deployment of your Azure resources. And when it comes to managed connectors, notice that I still need to create the actual API connection resources in Azure. So for the one I have created in the workflow for connecting to Dataverse, I have to create the corresponding API connection as a resource in Azure. As I said, either through the portal manually or by ARM template or CLI. So when you migrate from consumption logic apps to standard logic apps, you get an improvement as an additional type of connector, built-in connection, which does not require creation of a separate Azure resource. It is created by deployment process of the logic app, standard logic app. You only have to provide the right values for the properties of the connection, like the connection to the service bus. Let me give you a practical migration strategy. Inventory your connections. List all the connections you are currently using. Identify built-in opportunities. Check which of your connections can use built-in connectors. Plan your connection management. Decide how you'll handle connection strings and secrets. Set up your development environment. This includes the Logic App standard extension for Visual Studio Code. Migrate workflows incrementally. Don't try to do everything at once. Test thoroughly. Built-in connectors might behave slightly differently, so use time to test them first. Remember that while in consumption logic apps, Azure handle everything. In standard logic apps, however, you need to think about application settings, key vault integration, and deployment pipelines. Your next steps: try setting up a simple service bus connection using the built-in connector in a test environment. Get comfortable with the Visual Studio Code development experience before migrating production workloads. If this video helped you, please like and subscribe. Drop a comment if you have specific migration scenarios you'd like me to cover in future videos. Thanks for watching and good luck with your Logic Apps migrations.